is now 69 months and counting, and it's only 71% recovered in terms of the jobs that were lost. So this time, certainly, something has been very, very different. On this next slide, what you're going to see here is we're now looking at how the recovery in jobs, as slow as it has been, has compared to the recovery of the economy as measured by what we call gross domestic product or economic output. How well is the economy doing? The red line is the same jobs line that we were looking at here. The green line is the output of the U.S. economy. And what you see when you look at this is that while the jobs line is still lower on the right than it was when it began at the left, at the start of the recession, the green line is higher than it was before the recession began. Simply put, the economy is fully recovered. It just doesn't need the additional 2 million workers who've not gone back to work yet. And the reason it doesn't need them is because we've sent jobs to foreign nations. In large part, we've encouraged that. We've done everything that we could to facilitate that for decades in a number of ways. And the other piece of it is that technology is not going to ever get us back to full employment because technology allows one person to do the job of 3. So the truth is that where we are today in this very slow recovery that everyone's been talking about, and there's been a lot of blame to go around for how slow the recovery has been. In fact, it has little to do with governance. It has little to do with who's doing what right or wrong. And it has more to do with these new realities that we're facing, which will be long-term and permanent, at least within the perspective of our lifetimes. It's why corporate profits are at an all-time high. It's why Wall Street and the stock market are at all-time highs, and yet personal income is still depressed from when all of this began. And so here we get to see in very close-up terms what's happening with personal income in New Jersey versus the rest of the nation. We're looking at a period from 2006 to 2012, and what you see here is that income is up everywhere from 2006 to 2012, except here in New Jersey. In New Jersey, household income is actually down. And the reason for that is that all of these trends that I'm talking to you about are even more acute here in our state because New Jersey is the highest tax, highest cost of living state in the region, and it's one of the highest in the country. And so as a result, this compression that we've seen, this constraint of income and economic opportunity has been even more pronounced here. Here we get to see that one of the byproducts of the implementation of technology is that the output of the U.S. worker has continually risen, which means that companies don't need to hire as many people because of the technology that they've implemented. And so the net effect of this is that we are in the process of progressing to a European model for our New Jersey society, which is going to benefit places like Montclair because of its proximity and access to employment and to transportation. Just to show you some of the parallels here between what's happening in New Jersey and the United States in large part, although it's happening at an accelerated pace here in New Jersey, and what's happening, what exists in places like Europe. We're going to start to look at a couple of indicators here as we move along. First, I just wanted to give you a perspective as to the size of the generations that are sort of influential in terms of economic activity and housing demand. And what you can see here is that the largest parts of our society in New Jersey and nationally, and here we're looking at the national numbers, but New Jersey parallels this, is that we have an exaggerated number of individuals who are either aging baby boomers, which we can think of as empty nest households where the children for the most part have left, or the other large part of our population would be known as Generation Y, and these are people who more or less in their mid-30s or younger, who tend to be small in household size and also tend to be childless. Sandwiched in the middle is a relatively small generation known as Generation X. They're a very traditional generation. You can see that they're households that are between the ages of 37 and 48. They tend to be families. They tend to have children living at home. But they're the smallest part of what's happening here. The largest part of economic activity, purchasing power, housing demand resides in these large baby boom and Generation Y households, who for the most part are either one or two-person households who are childless. And so that gives us the first inkling that housing demand going forward will be very different than what we've known before. In fact, in New Jersey, 60% of all households are either one person or two person in size, and 70% of all households have no children under the age of 18. Just let that sink in for a moment. That's a statewide number. When we start to move locally into more urbanized places like Montclair or like Hudson County, that 70% moves up to about 80%. No children under the age of 18. And so the demand for the large suburban houses to raise one or two or three children in wide open green spaces, it just doesn't exist anymore. Here we get to see some of the trend lines that I'm telling you about. For example, we're seeing rapidly declining birth rates, fertility rates, far fewer children being born. 65% nationally of all households are childless. Here in New Jersey, it's 70%. Here we get to see how the birth rates per 1,000 women, the number of children born per 1,000 women has essentially cut in half over the last couple of decades. I can tell you the reasons for that. It's so expensive to live, and incomes are so minimal today, and the opportunity for economic growth, a rise in your income is so limited, that you really need to make a choice between hopefully being a homeowner or having children. You probably won't be able to afford both, because the cost of child care is prohibitive and salaries don't pay enough to afford home ownership rates. And so young people are making the decision to simply not have children. Today, 80% of all housing demand is situated in one or two person households. 80% of all people who are out there looking for a place to live, either to buy or to rent, are childless. And that tells you that demand is going to be very different. Oil prices, and by the way, that small household size and low fertility rates, very few children per household, that's a common characteristic in European markets. Very, very few children per household. Very different than the former prosperous American model. Here's another thing that's starting to parallel the European markets: very expensive oil. Europe has had it for decades. We're just beginning to get our initial tastes of it. Gasoline prices at $3, $3.50, $4 a gallon. The most dramatic effect of this is that it makes commuting prohibitively expensive, and it forces people to live closer to their jobs. Now, in past generations, the home search model for most people was what we refer to as drive till you qualify. Keep driving further and further from your job and eventually you'll arrive at a place where home prices are low enough that you can afford to buy a home. It does not work at $3.50 a gallon, because what you save on your mortgage is more than offset by what you need to put into your gas tank. Also a European trend for decades. New Jersey has been continuing to see over the last decade large numbers of what we call domestic outmigration. The truth is that for more than a decade in New Jersey, if we exclude foreign immigration from the population trends, New Jersey has been experiencing a net loss in population for more than a decade. A net loss of more than 50,000 people per year over the last 10 years of people deciding it's just too expensive to live here, and as a result, I'm going to move somewhere else where it's less expensive to live. Between 50 and 60,000 people, more people leave than move in every year if we exclude foreign immigration. And that will continue going forward. But we're starting to see another trend develop, and the more recent trend is, what we're starting to see is that households that are on the fringe are starting to leave the rural places, leave the outlying suburbs, and start to come back in to the job centers and back into the transportation corridors. Now, part of this is because it's more efficient to live in places where you can ride mass transportation. Just to put numbers to that, if a two-person household with two people working, using two cars to drive to their job, relocates to an inner ring suburb or urban place where they can eliminate one of those two cars because one people can walk or bus or take the train to work. The cost savings per year is equal to the mortgage payment, principal and interest, on $150,000 of mortgage principal. That's the savings in eliminating one car in New Jersey. And households are beginning to make that decision in increasing numbers. Today, the fastest growing population centers in New Jersey are the inner ring suburbs and cities, and the outlying areas in the state are losing population at an alarming rate. That trend will continue going forward as part of a European model. One of the better aspects, the more positive aspects of this reordering of the global economy, and sort of the downside to that is that many companies have opted to create jobs when they do create them in places outside of U.S. borders because of lower tax rates and lower labor rates. But a byproduct of that is that those companies find that in order to be able to connect and interact with their foreign operations, they need to relocate their U.S. offices to places that are near major airport hubs that allow them to have quick access to international destinations. And these are what we call gateway markets. And these are the markets today that are seeing the largest concentration of higher paying jobs being created. And here in Essex County, we're located in the midst of the largest gateway job cluster in the country, which begins in Philadelphia and runs all the way up to Boston. And so the economic growth that does occur in the United States will be disproportionately concentrated in this market from Philadelphia to Boston, where we are located. But the trend that we're seeing in those job creations is that those jobs are being created overwhelmingly in more urban places. For example, this is a study of all of the major employment markets around the United States, looking at what percentage of the jobs being created are being created in urbanized markets. Montclair would fit that category, as compared to more rural or suburban markets. And in the greater New York area, 78% of all economic investment and job creation over the last few years has been concentrated in more urbanized zip codes. The reason for this is clear. Companies are now moving their operations into places that are closer to transportation, closer to trains, and closer to New York City. And that means that we're going to see our population follow those job trends. So the job creation is being disproportionately located in places near to us here, and that's going to have a lot to do with what happens next with housing demand. Here we're looking at the trends in building permits in New Jersey in towns that have a train station. And what you can see is that the share of building permits over the last couple of decades in towns with train stations has gone from about 25% up to more than 50% over the last couple of decades. That will continue to rise. Real estate development is increasingly occurring in places that have train stations that connect to employment centers. Again, that's going to be that's part of a European model because of the efficiencies it creates, and that's going to be an engine for continued economic activity here in places like Montclair. Another aspect to consider is that New Jersey has one of the most restrictive land use policies in the nation in suburban markets. It's very difficult to get approval to build houses in suburban markets in New Jersey. It is much easier to get approvals to build housing units, be they multifamily rentals, condominiums, or single-family houses, much easier to get them in more urbanized places. And so builders are increasingly looking to come into more urbanized places to create housing because there it's easier to get the approvals to do that. Sort of a parallel to all that is that we're seeing a rapid rise in rental occupancy in the nation and here in New Jersey. That's also a byproduct of all of these trends. And the net effect of that is that we're seeing an increase in multifamily apartment types of housing. The occupancy in rental housing, tenancy in real estate has risen dramatically, and as it's risen, home ownerships have fallen dramatically, also consistent with the European model. And here in Montclair, there are a number of multifamily apartment properties that have been developed over the last number of years that are experiencing very high occupancy and performance levels, and many more housing units that are planned for the future. And so that is especially true here. And what we're seeing in the rental market is, and this is a concern for affordable housing, we're seeing that market rate rental prices are rising dramatically. Occupancies are essentially at full occupancy. Modern apartment properties are essentially experiencing zero vacancies, which has the effect of pushing prices higher, and then in turn intensifies the affordable housing crisis that we have in our state, which is one of the most expensive places for people to be able to find rental housing. And so that will create new challenges. I'm not sure if you heard it, but the Supreme Court in New Jersey just ruled. They struck down the Round 3 COA rules, and they demanded that the municipalities within the next 5 months come up with a real plan to create affordable housing opportunities for people in our state. This was a very positive development for affordable housing yesterday. And so there is a backside to this, which is that we're going to need to find a way to be able to create more affordable housing, and thankfully the Supreme Court saw it the same way yesterday here in New Jersey, and that's going to go a long way to helping us to solve that problem. In terms of what this all means and just sort of putting together where these trends will lead us as we head to the future, I have a couple of thoughts here. First of all, living in downtown markets, and I would include Montclair as a downtown market. And by that I'm talking about towns that have a central business corridor, Main Street design with businesses and transportation amenities. These downtown markets, they offer real solutions to all of these problems and challenges that I'm talking to you about, because constrained income and the high costs of living here demand more efficient ways to live. And also density. Smaller sized living spaces in higher densities are really the only way to achieve affordability, given the very high costs of land here in New Jersey. Also, this downtown living style is very sustainable. It's environmentally friendly. It's what we call extremely green, much greener than eliminating farmland and building residential subdivisions in a horizontal fashion. And so downtown living in a place like Montclair really does offer the solutions that we need, and therefore what we can expect to see is that more and more of these households who are opting to leave the area entirely as they aged will increasingly be deciding to stay local, but to trade down into smaller spaces in these walkable types of places. The transportation access here in Montclair and other towns like it are a magnet to attracting both people and businesses and jobs. And will continue to fuel not only residential development, but non-residential development. And what I'm talking about here is that commercial development tends to follow the housing patterns. So if you think back to the 1950s and 60s and 70s in New Jersey, back then, as housing moved further and further out from the city, the next thing that happened was that the employers began to move further and further away from the city to where the people were. Now that people are moving back into the core, jobs are already doing the same thing. And there is evidence of this across the country and specifically here in New Jersey. I mean, the most recent example of that would be the announcement about 6 months ago by Merck to vacate their White House station headquarters in Hunterdon County and to instead move into Summit because they wanted to be closer in to where the employment and transportation is and have better access to airports and to New York City. What will also follow all of this is not only will the jobs follow, but the retailers will follow as well. Because retailers need to be where housing is heading. Those are their customers. Unfortunately, this is a zero-sum game. And by that I mean that the gains that we're already seeing and will continue to see in inner ring suburbs like Montclair and in urban areas will be at the cost, at a loss, the loss of outer ring, ex-urban areas, rural markets, which will continue to lose economic vitality as we go further. But retailers will come next, and because they need to be where the people are. One of the sort of model markets that we in my industry watch to see what's developing is the Williamsburg section of New York City in Brooklyn. And we've watched the same phenomenon play out in Williamsburg. It's more advanced there, it's more progressed. First we saw warehouses being converted into apartments and loft-style apartments. The next thing that occurred was that the restaurants started to move in. The next thing was that jobs started to move back in. Ridership on mass transportation increased, and now what's happening is national retailers, the largest national retailers that you can think of, are in the process of buying up whole blocks, entire blocks in Williamsburg, to be able to open major retail venues for shopping, because they want to be where the people are. And that's really a model for what we're going to see in places here, like here in Essex County. There's places in Bergen County and Hudson County where the same will occur, and it's really a glimpse into where we're heading. There are some very dark skies on the horizon for luxury suburban housing in outlying suburbs and in more rural areas. There is a large oversupply of that housing built for households with 3 or 4 children living in 4,000 square foot homes on 2 acres where you would drive 40 minutes to get to your job, with 70% of all households in New Jersey being childless. It's clear to see that there's not going to be enough demand to absorb all the homes that baby boomers will be selling in those markets over the next 5 years. And so we're likely to see another downturn in prices in luxury suburban houses outside of the employment and transportation cores. But all of that will be to the benefit of what happens here in places like Montclair. And so in conclusion, we are here at just the beginning of a long-term renaissance of inner ring markets, which will see increased vitality, more job creation, more economic development than we've known in the past, and really unlimited opportunities going forward. So I think that concludes my comments, and I'm happy to take any questions that there may be before we move on.
Two questions, and then Mr. Allen has to sit down.
Okay.
Get started with our county.
Okay. Are there any?
You willing to do this in front of the town council?
Yes.
Assuming that the direct cost of increasing comes down by hourly, and the implications for affordability.
There is. Absolutely. Yeah. One of the natural byproducts of economic development and growth is that lower cost, affordable housing becomes increasingly scarce. And that is a big problem that we will need to address here in our state. And as I said, the ruling by the Supreme Court yesterday will help us move in that direction, because they've now mandated that towns must have a plan to accomplish specific affordable housing goals going forward. But it's going to take careful planning, and the best way to accomplish that is to encourage development of what's referred to often as inclusionary housing. Housing development, which includes both market rate housing units as well as more affordably priced housing units. That's the mechanism by which this can best be accomplished, because generally speaking, the construction of affordable housing by private investors is not a profitable undertaking. The costs are nearly as much as building market rate housing, but the income that you receive from that is is reduced. And so the way that that can best be accomplished is by enticing developers to build market rate housing units which have included in the project some allocation of units which will be price controlled, which will be affordable housing. And that's the mechanism that we'll need to look to. Typically, those allocations are somewhere between 10% and 20% of the total housing units, that's our best model.
Any other questions?
So you spoke about government and its role, and you mentioned that government doesn't create jobs, and is not responsible for all the economic policy. Some would argue that. Some would say, well, the government CA and World War II kind of helped pick up the robust economy relations. Maybe a coup inside of World War, not just for everybody. But what is that? What do you think is the role of government in equalizing costs and expenses? Like one, people are housing, because the government is living environment. What else could government do to ameliorate some of the costs that they
There's very little that can be done at a local government level. The best chance for government at a state or at a national level, and that's really where this problem can be influenced most. At a higher level, let's say at a national level, for example, the focus needs to be on creating economic opportunity, creating real jobs that provide an opportunity for advancement. And we're not doing that here in our country presently. What we are creating, for the most part, recently have been